this video, I'll be going through some teachings and life lessons from a very famous book known as The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Content Corner, and today I'm revisiting one of the first books I ever read, which is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Now many of you might be familiar with the Habit book, which is Atomic Habits by James Clear. I genuinely urge you to have a read and listen, because it is on Audible as well, about this kind of one of the gold standard books in this field about how to change habits, and many evidences and examples of how when you change a habit you can really excel and succeed in life. But before I go into the book and some life lessons I learned from Charles Duhigg, I want to remember, why are habits important? Why are they necessary? Believe it or not, your brain requires less or minimal activity when something is done in a routine. The classic example I like to use is, imagine you're driving, using a manual car, and over time it becomes nearly autonomous for you to change gears, use your indicators or blinkers, get to your destination without even realizing you've done anything. So many a time you finish work or you go home and you actually don't realize how the past half an hour has gone. That's why habits are incredibly important, because it utilizes minimal energy and time in your brain. So that time and that energy and that capacity can be better used for other more intensive tasks. So the more things you have in routine, the better you're equipped to do other things in your life. So remember, doing habits saves energy and time for our brain. So the more we do, the better it is. But how do we actually look at this from Charles Duhigg's point of view? So this book by Charles Duhigg is broken down into a few parts. One is the actual habit loop, which I'll come to next. 2, the golden rule of habit change. 3, triggers that cause these habits to occur. And then 4, many life lessons and experiences and evidences of these playing out in action, from businesses to companies to sports coaches to severe patients, and how this evidence of habit loops and changing bad habits into good ones, or accelerating habits known as Keystone Habits into better ones, is talked about. So what is the habit loop? It's probably something you may have come across, but a reminder is always beneficial. So the habit loop is basically the cue, the routine, and the reward. It's a 3-step process that kind of encompasses all habits that we have. So the cue is what triggers the habit. The routine is what you actually do in terms of that habit. And the reward is that feeling or sensation that you get from doing that routine. And Charles Duhigg talks about how this is a universal concept in terms of habit formation, and how we can utilize this to try to change bad habits and not remove them. But I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But you're probably wondering, what actually triggers a habit? And there are actually a few ways this does, and it's actually really powerful to remember. So I have location, time, emotions, others, and the last action that you did. These are a few examples of key cues or triggers that starts a habit, whether it's a good habit or whether it's a bad one. And then Charles Duhigg kind of talks about where these cues are utilized, and then how this habit loop, when it's changed and when it's adopted and when it's optimized, it can really curb some habits that were ingrained when you were born. And I'm going to go through some of the examples later on. But before we do that, what is the golden rule of habit change? Now remember those 3 things I told you about: the cue, the routine, and the reward. Cues are ingrained. It is very difficult to change the cue in terms of changing a habit. So if you have a cue to eat something, you have a craving, or you have a desire, you have again those emotions, those cues are very hard to kind of change or reverse. And if you look at the third part, which is the reward, is that satisfying feeling, that craving, that sense of being more comfortable, or that euphoric feeling. That's also very difficult to change the reward that you want when you do something. So what Charles Duhigg and many scientists at the time also talked about is changing the middle part, which is a routine. So it's very difficult to stop a bad habit, but you can be more effective by changing the habit itself. And the golden rule of habit change is actually to change the routine, keep the cues the same. So it might be an emotion, it might be a desire, it might be your last action, so your habit you have at the time. And the reward is the same, you have that craving, that satisfying feeling. But it's the routine that actually changes. But something to really remember is, when you do change the routine, you do see effective results in you changing a habit. But there's something else that's very important to make sure that new habit stays there for an extended period of time. So you're probably wondering, what is this extra thing? We know that routine is very important, but what's this extra caveat to make sure that routine stays? It's actually an ingrained belief in yourself. So here's some examples of how this actually played out. So one of the best examples I like to talk about from the book, which I really enjoyed, is how Charles Duhigg talks about a former coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, an American football team. His name was Coach Duhigg. Now, Coach Duhigg came in with a very revolutionized approach to coaching football players. And instead of looking at skills and drills, he focused on ingraining very key habits when they saw a trigger. Now, what I mean by this is, when you start American football and you have the scrum about to, the ball is to feed off. Again, I don't know too much about American football. But when that happens, what Charles Duhigg tried to instill in his players is, when you see certain cues from the opposition, this habit should start. So when you see the person's right leg shifting, when you see the person's eye contact moving that way, when you see the body weight moving, when you see these cues happening, that should automatically trigger a habit. So this triggering of habit bypassed the need of thinking, which saved time. And we know with any sport, the more time you can save in making decisions, the quicker, more kind of essentially, the faster you can adapt to react to any situation. And many coaches or many clubs across the world were like, across the American football area, was like, this is bonkers. It was very modern, very revolutionary, very novel in terms of way of thinking. And Tampa Bay were the only people at the time, only club at the time, who would take on this kind of approach. And for some time, they kept on losing. But at one point in time, this change in their routine, the cues were still the same as we remember. The reward in terms of getting the ball or changing or causing a turnover was still there. But it was the routine that changed, fitting in line with the habit loop. But suddenly, over time, they actually will start to see a change in habit. They started to utilize this in match day practice. But then Coach Duhigg observed something else, which is what I'm going to talk about now. And that was, when they encountered a high pressure situation, they all reverted back to the old habit. So all the players reverted back to an old habit, which is why the ingrained kind of belief was one of the core ways to counteract this old habit coming back again. And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, when Coach Duhigg's son committed suicide, all the players came around for a common belief and goal to be around the coach. Although as tragic and as unfortunate that was for Coach Duhigg and the team and his family, in terms of the habit loop, it ingrained a new sense of belief and purpose for the rest of the team, that they started to believe in Coach Duhigg more, because he was still adamant about this new way of coaching. Because that new belief was there, and they already knew about changing the routine, that belief helped them to override the old habits that they had, and they actually went on to win the Super Bowl. So changing the routine is one thing. Having an ingrained belief or sense of purpose is another thing, to make sure that new habit that you have stays in no matter what or high pressure situation you're in. And that's something to bear in mind, that if you're looking to change the habits, there has to be an ingrained belief as well to make sure that habit stays there for a long period of time. But Aamir, what about good habits? How can you kind of accelerate them potentially? Believe it or not, Charles Duhigg talks about this, and I'm going to talk about it now. You probably have heard of the term Keystone Habit. Now, this is something that James Clear and many speakers around the world have talked about in terms of changing the way you are by instilling Keystone habits. And when Charles Duhigg described it many, many years ago, it was profound, because what he talks about is how a habit, once ingrained, can spill over into other parts of your life, and it creates essentially a domino effect of essentially creating new habits, better habits in other parts of your life by changing one habit early on. Now, you can see on the screen some examples of these Keystone habits. One of my favorites is your morning routine. It's very early time at the start of your day, and if you can get that right and have a good habit there, what you learn from there spills over into your work, how you are, how you eat, how you look after yourself, how you interact with others, what you do towards the rest of the day can be formalized and be optimized based on your morning routine. And Keystone Habits create essentially what we call small wins in your day or in your kind of next hour of life that gives you that euphoric feeling to then utilize these habits for other things. And one of the most famous and enjoyable examples I actually use from the book is all about Michael Phelps. Now, Michael Phelps, if you don't know who he is, was a very, very iconic, decorated and famous swimmer for the US national team. Also termed as Aquaman because of the tons of medals that he won. But what was more profound for many other people is how he became who he was and how he was able to consistently win day after day during Olympic matches. Because you have to remember, swimmers have a lot of events during Olympics and competitions. So how did he keep that high level of mentality and thinking and action to win tens of medals throughout Olympics, World Championships? The key, or the Keystone Habit, his coach instilled on him very, very early on. And it's the famous videotape visualization. So what the coach did was ingrained into Michael Phelps. When the race was to start, cue the videotape. What that meant was Michael Phelps would be in his zone and play out a videotape of him winning a race. Imagine him winning the race. So he would visualize the end goal and all the stages that would happen of him going through the water, beating everybody else, getting to that end of the swimming pool first. And that routine put him in the right. So that's one Keystone Habit, by the way. That helped him to have his mindset spot on. Helped him to have a pre-match routine, because that will start with the videotape. Helping to eat right and maintain his peak performance during these activities. Make sure that just before that, seconds before he is about to push off, everything's already ingrained. That one cue, the videotape visualization, again, links in the description about this as well, cued a series of routines so ingrained, it can even be argued that he became autonomous to some degree when he was swimming. Because he was so rooted in all the little routines, even what he was doing within the water. Because he was watching himself beforehand, him breathing properly, his strides were spot on, his rolls when he reached the other side of the swimming pool and coming back were all ingrained in that videotape he was watching. And that all came from a very simple Keystone Habit. So all of the habits that went along from pre-match or pre-race to the race to post-race came from that Keystone Habit. And actually Michael Phelps himself attributes a lot of his success to that videotape visualization. So imagine we can visualize certain end goals in our life. Again, a lot of people who watch me on the channel are from a research background. So imagine you trying to finish a PhD and visualize yourself holding that doctorate. Reverse engineer all of the routines that need to be in place in order for you to get there. But in order to try and change certain habits, the notion of willpower becomes very, very important. But what you may not realize is willpower is actually a muscle, not a skill. And when I first read this about a few years ago, I was fascinated with this concept of willpower actually being a muscle. Because what Charles Duhigg talks about, and some actual series of experiments that researchers did back in just before 1998, talked about how repeating scenarios where you're utilizing willpower means that willpower becomes depleted, so you're more likely to give in to something else, or more likely to get frustrated with something else later on. So believe it or not, Charles Duhigg talks about Roy Baumeister. In 1998, he conducted a very famous experiment, which was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And what he talked about is a group of 67 individuals were in a room. And remember, this is a test of willpower, being a muscle, not a skill. And these individuals were put in a room and they started to smell freshly baked cookies. And they were even tempted with freshly baked cookies in front of them. Half of them were given the cookies and half of them were kind of tempted and baited. And they were given some sort of radishes instead. So something they were not too keen on having and weren't happy on having it. So when the group of people had the cookies, they were really enjoyable, they enjoyed it, they were like, oh yeah, that was great. But there was that group of people who had the radishes, even though they were promised and tempted with freshly baked cookies that they were looking forward to. So they had to use a lot of willpower to say, oh fine, I'll have the radishes. I was looking forward to that, but I'll have the radishes. And then the next phase of this experiment is where all of the individuals and participants were given what seemed to be a random puzzle, which was actually impossible to do. But it was to see how long they would try and fix this puzzle before giving up. And the people who had the radishes first gave up far quicker than the people who had the cookies. And what it was the demonstration of is how willpower was utilized when they had to eat the radishes, and it became depleted. So they were more frustrated because of what happened before in terms of utilizing more willpower to finish the puzzle. So this was a demonstration that willpower is incredibly important, and believe it or not, even though it is a muscle, just like we do when we're training our body, if we can create habits, we can help make willpower become more autonomous over time. And how you can create willpower to be more effective for you and become more autonomous, so it feels like you have stronger willpower, is by understanding the habits that arise when you realize something that you don't want to do and you have to use a lot of willpower to do it. So inflection points are what we call things that kind of trigger something to change. So for example, it's late at night and you have a craving for snacks or for something like a drink or for something like that. Having an understanding of, okay, this is how I'm going to feel. To preempt this is the routine I'm going to try and instill. The willpower then becomes autonomous because you have a set in stone action about what to do when willpower is required, essentially. And when you do that over time, that autonomous feeling becomes more active. And like I mentioned at the start of the video, your brain requires less time and energy to do that. So you're actually utilizing less willpower to overcome that previous action or trigger. Doing that over time, your willpower is perceived to be stronger. So those were just a few little tips and lessons that I really enjoyed from listening and reading this book by Charles Duhigg, known as The Power of Habit. I'm now going to look into the James Clear Atomic Habits and see the comparison between the two books in another episode. But before I go, I just want to share some kind of take-home messages that we can all use, for me first and foremost. And one is, before you go into understanding, okay, habit formation, do a self-audit of yourself. Record all of your actions and things you do and say in a week, from big actions to small, from maybe major ones to minor ones. And then start to see patterns of what you think are routines. Once you have that in place, start to understand, okay, consciously and honestly, what are these triggers? Because we don't actually have a conversation to talk with ourselves a lot. I make a lot of videos on YouTube, but believe me, I talk even more to myself outside of videography. Because I want to try and understand, why is it that I'm doing this or doing that, or saying this or saying that. So you have to kind of have a conscious talk with yourself about, okay, these are these actions that I do that I actually want to excel in. These are actions that I want to do that I want to replace. These are the routines that I want to replace. And believe it or not, the famous why and how thing that I try to talk about a lot, utilize it here. Why are you doing this? How is it occurring? What are the cues? Remember the cues that we mentioned early on in the video. And once you have that all set in place, then you can start to utilize, okay, how can I change this routine? How can I preempt this action so I have a stronger sense of willpower over time? And one caveat to remember is, look at your morning and your evening routines. They are incredibly powerful and dictate a lot of how you sleep based on what you did in the evening, and how you are during the day based on what you did in the morning. And look at routines and keystone habits that you can try and instill to better utilize yourself throughout the entire 24-hour day. And lastly, two things to remember. And Charles Duhigg really emphasizes these, where if you slip up, leave it as a slip up. Don't entertain it, don't exacerbate it more like, oh, that's it, I've wasted time, I've messed up now. Because the more you elongate that process, the more chances you are going to destroy all the good routines and progress you have made. If it's a slip up, if it's a temporary slip up, leave it at that, and then carry on from the next day or the next hour for the habit that you were actually instilling. The more you do that, the more you just leave it temporarily, don't think too much about it, and come back, the more likely you are to continue the habit that you try to instill. And lastly, what Charles Duhigg talks about, which is fascinating, is this notion of chunking, where you ingrain a series of actions into a routine. So when you've done that self-audit that I talked about before, look at a series of actions that you have that can then form into a routine. And the more you do that, the more autonomous it becomes, the less energy and time and resources your body utilizes to do that routine. So the more time kind of spared, the more brain activity spared to utilize other things that you need to do throughout the day. So look at ways you can instill chunking in many parts of your day. And now to finish off with, like I said, many of the people who view this channel, I hope, are actually researchers. So remember, this book is very applicable to you in terms of your research performance. What are you doing in the lab that could be optimized? What routines are you doing that actually are hindering your progress in terms of analyzing data, writing data, researching things? What distractions are occurring that are triggering bad habits in the lab or when you're at home or when you're analyzing things at home? Have a think and then utilize the power of habit to become more effective and more efficient as a researcher. And if you've got any questions or advices of how I instill habits when I did my PhD, do let me know in the comments. Have a look at me on Instagram, Aamir.phd, or email me at aamir@researchtribe.org. But to finish off with, thank you for watching episode 2 of Content Corner. I really enjoyed talking about this, and I'm hoping to do more book reviews and Audible reviews. Do check this book out on Audible. This video is sponsored by myself, not Audible, but do check them out because I was just listening to it while I was driving, while I was at work. So I do recommend Audible books to ingrain more useful content in a audio format. But in any case, I'd like to let you enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Remember, we've got PhD 101 on Sunday, which is just part 2 of the expectations versus realities 2-part special. So I hope to see you there. But thank you for watching and take care.